Officer woke up that morning with the sun streaming through his bedroom window, casting golden rectangles across his modest apartment floor. It was a typical Tuesday in Portland, Oregon, the kind of day where the weather couldn't decide between spring warmth and lingering winter chill. He stretched, his joints cracking slightly, a reminder that he wasn't as young as he used to be. At 38, had been with the Portland Police Department for over a decade, and the last 3 years with the K-9 unit had been the most rewarding of his career. He shuffled into the kitchen, and the familiar sound of his coffee maker gurgled to life. While waiting for the brew, reviewed his schedule for the day on his phone. Community fair at Riverside Park, 2 p.m., demonstration and meet and greet with local families. He'd done this event twice before in previous years, and each time it had gone smoothly. Kids loved Scout. Parents appreciated seeing the police department in a positive light. It was straightforward community relations work, important but routine. By the time arrived at the station at 7 in the morning, Scout was already awake in his kennel, his tail wagging with infectious enthusiasm. Scout was a purebred German Shepherd, 3 years old, with a glossy black and tan coat that gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the K-9 facility. His ears perked up the moment appeared, and the dog released a soft, eager whine. This was their ritual, would unlock the kennel, and Scout would bound out with controlled excitement, pressing his head against leg in greeting. "Good morning, buddy," said, running his hand along Scout's muscular neck. "Big day today. We're going to show those kids what a real police dog can do." Scout responded by spinning in a tight circle, his tail creating a blur of motion. The dog was incredibly well trained, with an uncanny ability to read human emotions and situations. Had watched Scout track suspects through thick brush, detect narcotics hidden in vehicle compartments, and comfort traumatized witnesses with an almost supernatural gentleness. But this morning, something was different about the dog's energy. As led Scout through their pre-deployment routine, checking paws, teeth, and general health, he noticed Scout was more restless than usual. The dog paced in his designated area instead of settling into his calm pre-work state. His ears were pinned forward constantly, twitching at every sound. Scout's nose worked overtime, sniffing the air as if catching scents from miles away. Frowned slightly, running through a mental checklist. Scout had eaten well, his water bowl was clean, there were no signs of illness or injury. The dog's physical exam had been perfect just yesterday during their routine checkup. "You feeling okay, Scout?" asked, watching the dog's behavior carefully. Scout pressed against his leg, then pulled away, repeating the cycle several times. It was unusual. Typically, Scout was calm and centered before a community event, almost as if he understood the importance of representing the department well. Decided not to overthink it. Perhaps Scout was simply picking up on the fact that this was a departure from their usual patrol routine. Dogs were extraordinarily perceptive creatures, and Scout had always been more sensitive than most. Grabbed Scout's leash and headed toward the parking lot, where the patrol car was already prepped and ready. The drive to Riverside Park took 15 minutes. Spring sunshine flooded through the windshield as navigated the familiar streets of Portland. Classical music played softly on the radio, another part of their ritual that seemed to calm Scout before public appearances. But today, even the soft strains of couldn't settle the dog. Scout's head remained high, his body tense against the harness that kept him secure in the back of the vehicle. Pulled into the park at 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes earlier than planned. Through the windshield, he could see the community fair in full swing. Colorful booths dotted the open field. Children ran between attractions. The smell of funnel cakes and popcorn drifted across the parking area. It should have been a perfect day, sunshine, community spirit, and a chance to showcase the important work the K-9 unit did for Portland. As secured Scout's lead and opened the back door, the dog practically leaped out of the vehicle. This was also unusual. Scout was ordinarily a model of canine discipline, waiting for explicit permission before exiting any vehicle. Today, he strained forward, his nails clicking urgently against the asphalt. "Whoa, Scout. Easy, buddy," commanded, using his authoritative training voice. Scout responded immediately, falling into heel position, but his entire body remained coiled and alert. The dog's muscles trembled slightly beneath his glossy coat. His amber eyes scanned the park with an intensity that had only seen during active investigations or dangerous situations. Walked Scout toward the designated demonstration area, and he noticed several things happening simultaneously. Scout's nose was working at maximum capacity, twitching and flexing as he processed hundreds of different scents that humans couldn't even imagine. The dog's ears rotated independently, tracking sounds far beyond normal human hearing range. More concerning, Scout's tail had dropped slightly, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Something's got you rattled, isn't it?" murmured, feeling a trickle of concern run down his spine. In his decade of police work, had learned to trust his instincts, and Scout's instincts were far sharper than his own. As they approached the crowd of waiting families, realized he couldn't identify exactly what was bothering Scout. There was nothing visibly wrong at the park. No aggressive people, no obvious threats, no animals acting strangely. And yet, Scout continued to behave as though he'd picked up on something dangerous, something wrong, something that demanded his complete and undivided attention. Took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and pushed the feeling aside. He was a professional. He had a job to do. He would give the demonstration, do the meet and greet, and head home. Whatever was making Scout anxious would likely pass. Had no idea that this day would change everything, that Scout's mysterious alertness was about to guide them toward a truth that no one else had detected, and that a small child's life hung in the balance of what happened next. Jennifer sat in her beat-up Civic in the parking lot of Riverside Park, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her hands were shaking again. She hated when they did that. It made her feel weak, out of control, and right now, she desperately needed to feel like she had at least some semblance of control over her life. In the back seat, her two children sat in silence. Tommy, her 6-year-old son, stared out the window with the kind of vacant expression that broke her heart every single time she saw it. His school uniform, a blue polo shirt that was a size too small, was wrinkled and had what looked like yesterday's lunch stains near the collar. His sneakers, purchased from a thrift store 3 months ago, were already showing signs of wear at the heels. Next to him, Emma, her youngest at just 3 years old, sat motionless in a car seat that had seen better days, the straps frayed and one of the buckles slightly broken. Emma was a ghost of a child. That's what Jennifer sometimes thought when she looked at her daughter. The girl had once been vibrant, full of toddler energy and endless questions about the world. But that version of Emma seemed to have faded away, leaving behind this quiet, hollow-eyed child who barely spoke and rarely smiled. Emma's hair, which should have been silky and golden, was matted and dull, with what looked like breakfast cereal tangled into one of the braids Jennifer had attempted that morning while rushing. "Come on, kids," Jennifer said, her voice hoarse from disuse and too many cigarettes. She'd quit smoking once years ago when she was pregnant with Tommy. That felt like a lifetime ago now. "Let's go. Tommy, you wanted to see the police dog, remember?" Tommy nodded slowly, unbuckling himself without waiting for help. He'd learned early how to be independent, how to manage his own needs because his mother was often too preoccupied or too tired to help. At 6 years old, he opened his own door, unbuckled Emma from her car seat, and took his little sister's hand with a protectiveness that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Jennifer grabbed her purse from the passenger seat, running her fingers through her own tangled brown hair in a futile attempt to make herself look presentable. She caught her reflection in the mirror and immediately regretted it. The woman staring back at her looked haunted. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes like bruises. Her complexion was pale and blotchy. Her mouth had developed permanent worry lines. She was only 32 years old, but exhaustion had aged her by at least a decade. The truth was, Jennifer hadn't wanted to come today. She'd spent most of last night arguing with her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. She wasn't even sure anymore what to call him. The fights were getting worse. Yesterday had grabbed Tommy's wrist so hard it left a mark. When Jennifer had protested, had backhanded her across the face. This morning, she'd covered the bruise with makeup, changed Tommy's shirt to hide the wrist marks, and decided that getting out of the apartment for a few hours might actually be the thing she could do. She'd overheard Tommy's teacher mentioning the community fair and the police dog demonstration. Normally, Jennifer wouldn't bother with such things. She preferred to keep her family isolated, under the radar, invisible. But today, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of their small, filthy apartment, she'd mentioned it to Tommy. He'd perked up slightly at the mention of a dog, which was rare enough that Jennifer had decided to make the drive. As they walked across the parking lot toward the fair, Jennifer felt her anxiety mounting. She wasn't good with crowds. She wasn't good with people looking at her, judging her. And lately, every interaction felt loaded with judgment. The way the grocery store clerk looked at her when she paid with food stamps. The way teachers at Tommy's school asked probing questions about his bruises and his frequent absences. The way neighbors would sometimes peek out from behind their curtains when she came home late. The fair was in full swing when they arrived. Colorful booths advertising local businesses and organizations lined the perimeter. Children ran between attractions, a bounce house, a face-painting station, a game booth with cheap prizes. The scent of fair food hung heavy in the air. Funnel cakes, corn dogs, cotton candy. It smelled like happiness, like normal families enjoying normal days. Jennifer felt the familiar sensation of being an outsider looking in through a window. She steered Tommy and Emma toward the back of the crowd gathering for the police dog demonstration. She chose to stand far away from other families, instinctively avoiding interaction. Jennifer had become an expert at making herself invisible, at blending into the background. It was a survival mechanism, something she'd learned long ago when she realized that drawing attention only brought problems. Tommy's grip on Emma's hand loosened slightly as he focused on the police officer and the dog that were preparing for the demonstration. For the first time in days, Jennifer saw something flicker in her son's eyes. Interest, curiosity, maybe even hope. That small spark made her throat tighten with emotion. Emma, meanwhile, remained completely silent and still. The little girl had barely spoken in weeks. Her pediatrician, whom Jennifer saw infrequently and always tried to avoid, had mentioned something about developmental delays, but Jennifer couldn't afford therapy or specialists. She could barely afford rent, let alone professional help for her traumatized daughter. As they waited for the demonstration to begin, Jennifer's leg bounced nervously. Her fingers twisted together. She kept glancing around, as if she expected to suddenly appear and drag them all back home. The fear was constant now, a low-level hum of dread that never quite went away. She noticed other families around them, mothers who looked put together, wearing clean clothes and engaging smiles. Their children wore properly fitting shoes that matched. Their hair was brushed and styled. They held their parents' hands with the casual confidence of children who felt safe and loved. Jennifer watched these families and felt a deep, gnawing sense of shame. This was what she'd failed to provide for her children: safety, stability, love without conditions or violence. As Officer and Scout began their demonstration, Jennifer tried to focus on the present moment. She told herself that this was just a few hours away from the apartment. Just a brief respite from the chaos. She had no idea that her children were being observed by someone far more perceptive than any human in that crowd, someone whose senses could detect truths that Jennifer had desperately tried to hide. The fair continued around them, full of laughter and light, but Jennifer and her children remained in the shadows at the back, waiting for something they couldn't yet name. Officer stood in the center of the demonstration area, with Scout positioned at his left side in perfect heel formation. A crowd of approximately 30 people, mostly families with children ranging from toddlers to preteens, watched with rapt attention. The afternoon sun beat down warmly and could feel beads of sweat forming at his temples. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and took a deep breath. "Good afternoon, everyone," began, his voice practiced and clear. "My name is Officer, and this is Scout, one of our K-9 officers with the Portland Police Department. Scout has been working with us for 3 years, and today we're going to show you some of the incredible things police dogs can do to help keep our community safe." Scout stood motionless beside him, the perfect picture of canine discipline. The dog's ears were alert, his posture straight, his breathing controlled. To the untrained eye, Scout looked calm and ready, but who had worked with this dog every single day for 3 years could feel the tension radiating from Scout's body. The dog's muscles were bunched beneath his fur like coiled springs ready to release. "First, I want to talk about Scout's sense of smell," continued, beginning to walk in a slow circle to demonstrate Scout's training. Dogs like Scout have up to 300 million olfactory receptors in their noses. That's compared to about 6 million in humans. A dog's sense of smell is approximately 10,000 to 100,000 times more sensitive than ours. This means Scout can detect odors that are completely imperceptible to human beings. As spoke, he noticed Scout's nose working overtime. The dog's nostrils flared rhythmically, his head moving subtly as he processed scents from different directions. Scout's ears rotated backward and forward, tracking sounds that no one else in the crowd could hear. The dog's tail, normally held at a relaxed angle, had dropped slightly lower than its usual position. Led Scout through a basic obedience demonstration. "Scout, sit." The dog immediately sat, his haunches touching the ground with precision. "Scout, down." Scout lowered himself to a prone position, his chin resting on his paws. The crowd applauded and several children giggled with delight. But Scout's attention seemed divided. While his body responded perfectly to each command, the dog's eyes remained unfocused, his mind seemingly elsewhere. A young girl in the crowd raised her hand. "What's Scout's favorite thing to do?" she asked eagerly. Smiled, "Great question. Scout loves to work. His favorite thing is using his nose to find things, whether that's missing people, drugs, or other items that help us solve crimes. Scout was born to search and to help others. It's what makes him happy." As was explaining Scout's training methodology, he decided to move the demonstration to the next phase. He pulled out a small training dummy filled with narcotics that had been scent imprinted for training purposes. It was a controlled substance used specifically for police dog training. "Now, Scout is going to demonstrate his narcotics detection abilities," announced. "I'm going to hide this training dummy in one of several locations, and Scout is going to find it using only his sense of smell." Moved to place the dummy behind a nearby tree, but as he turned to walk in that direction, Scout suddenly pulled hard against his leash. Not aggressively, but with an unusual urgency that made stop in his tracks. Scout's entire body had gone rigid. The dog's gaze had locked onto something in the distance, toward the back of the crowd where a woman and 2 children stood somewhat isolated from the other families. "Scout," said his voice questioning, "what is it, buddy?" The dog didn't respond to his command. Instead, Scout took a step forward, his leash taut, his body trembling with what could only be described as intensity. Had worked with Scout long enough to recognize when the dog had detected something significant. This was the same body language Scout exhibited when trailing suspects or locating hidden contraband. But they weren't on a call. They were at a community fair. "Excuse me for just a moment," said to the crowd, maintaining his professional demeanor while internally alarmed. "Scout seems to have picked up on something. This sometimes happens at demonstrations." Allowed Scout to lead him slowly through the crowd. The dog's nose worked frantically, his tail still low, his breathing rapid and shallow. They weaved between families and noticed people stepping aside, sensing that something unusual was happening. Parents pulled their children closer, wondering if there was some kind of threat. Scout pulled directly toward the family at the back. The woman, a thin, tired-looking woman with stringy brown hair and dark circles under her eyes, took a step back nervously. The older boy, perhaps 6 or 7, gripped the woman's hand tightly. But it was the youngest child, a tiny girl of maybe 3 years old with matted hair and mismatched shoes, who captured Scout's complete attention. Scout stopped directly in front of the little girl and froze. Had never seen anything quite like it. The dog didn't jump or try to play. He didn't wag his tail or show any of the friendly, social behaviors Scout typically displayed during public interactions. Instead, Scout simply stared. The dog's amber eyes locked onto the small child's face with an intensity that made the hair on its neck stand on end. The crowd had grown quiet. Everyone sensed that something significant was happening, though no one could quite articulate what it was. The air seemed to thicken. Time seemed to slow down. The sounds of the fair, the distant music, the laughter of other children, the rustle of movement, all faded into background noise. Scout's body trembled. The dog's legs were slightly splayed, as if he needed to brace himself for the weight of whatever emotion or sensation he was experiencing. His ears were pinned forward with complete focus. His jaw was slack, his breathing heavy. Had trained Scout for narcotics detection, explosive detection, and suspect apprehension. But he'd never trained the dog for this, for whatever emotional or intuitive connection Scout was making with this fragile, hollow-eyed child. The little girl, Emma, stared back at Scout. Her eyes, which had been vacant and lifeless moments before, suddenly seemed to see something. Something real. Something important. The two beings, a German Shepherd police dog and a 3-year-old child, locked in a moment of perfect understanding that transcended species and communication. Felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, though he couldn't explain why. All his training, all his experience, all his instincts were screaming that this moment mattered. That Scout was trying to tell him something. That this small child was trying to communicate something urgent and desperate. The woman, Jennifer, looked confused and increasingly anxious. "Is something wrong?" she asked nervously. "Is Scout okay?" But Officer barely heard her. He was transfixed by what was happening before him, a silent conversation between a dog and a child, a moment of connection that seemed to contain worlds of meaning. The silence stretched between Scout and Emma like a living thing. Officer held his breath, waiting for something he couldn't name. Around them the fair continued, distant music, scattered laughter, the sound of children playing, but it all seemed muted, occurring in a different dimension entirely. In this small corner of the park, the only reality that existed was the dog and the child, locked in their inexplicable communion. Emma's lips trembled. Noticed it first, the subtle quivering of a child's mouth before tears or words emerge. The little girl's breathing, which had been shallow and almost imperceptible, deepened. Her small chest rose and fell beneath a shirt that was too big for her, hanging loose and wrinkled. Her eyes, which moments before had been glassy and detached, suddenly sharpened with something approaching awareness. Scout's tail, which had been still and low, began to move. Not in the exuberant wagging of a happy dog, but in slow, deliberate movements. The dog's breathing synchronized with Emma's, as if they were communicating through respiration, through some primal language that existed before words were invented. "Help me," Emma said. The words were soft, almost whispered, but they landed in the afternoon air like thunder. Clear, steady, unmistakable. Officer felt his knees weaken. In 14 years of police work, he had heard many confessions, many desperate pleas, many heartbreaking statements. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever impacted him with the force of those two words emerging from a 3-year-old's mouth. "Help me," Emma repeated, her voice slightly louder this time, as if the act of speaking had loosened something inside her. Tears began to stream down her small face, but she didn't cry or whimper. She simply stood there, staring at Scout, and repeated her plea, "Help me." Jennifer gasped. The sound was sharp, shocked, as if her daughter's words had physically struck her. "Emma, what are you? Why would you?" She reached for the child, her hand extended, but Emma flinched away, moving closer to Scout instead of toward her mother. Tommy, the older boy, released his mother's hand and stepped protectively toward his sister. His young face had gone pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked like resignation. He seemed to understand what his sister had just done, and the implications of it. At 6 years old, Tommy appeared to recognize that an invisible barrier had been crossed, that his sister had just spoken words that could not be unspoken, that everything was about to change. Felt the weight of the moment settle over his shoulders like a physical thing. His police training kicked into overdrive, every sense sharpened, every instinct activated. He looked at Jennifer, really looked at her, and saw things he'd somehow missed before, the way her hands shook, the nervous energy in her movements, the dark makeup caked under her eyes attempting to cover something, the bruise on her jaw partially concealed by her hair, the way she kept glancing around as if afraid of being watched. He looked at Tommy and saw the telltale signs of a child living under tremendous stress. The hunched shoulders, the way he unconsciously tried to make himself smaller, the wariness in his eyes when he looked at his mother. Had attended training seminars on recognizing child abuse and neglect. He'd learned the signs, seen the statistics, heard the stories. And now, standing before him in the middle of a sunny afternoon at a community fair, was a living, breathing example of everything those trainings had warned him about. Scout pressed against Emma gently, his large body providing a barrier between the child and the world. The dog's presence seemed to ground Emma, to anchor her in the moment. The little girl's hand moved, trembling, and came to rest on Scout's head. Her small fingers threaded through the dog's fur with surprising tenderness. "Is everything okay here?" asked, his voice dropping into the professional tone he used during investigations. Gone was the cheerful community relations officer. In his place stood a detective, an investigator, a protector. "Everything's fine," Jennifer said quickly, too quickly. Her voice had taken on a strained, artificial brightness. "Emma's just tired. She gets fussy when she hasn't napped. Kids, say thank you to the nice officer and his dog." But Tommy didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on his sister's face, as if trying to communicate silently with her. Emma, meanwhile, continued to stroke Scout's head, seemingly finding comfort and courage in the dog's presence. The crowd around them had begun to notice that something unusual was transpiring. Parents had stopped watching the demonstration. They whispered to each other, their eyes flicking toward the small family at the back. Could feel their curiosity, their confusion, their sudden awareness that this was no longer a simple community event. "What's your daughter's name?" asked, already knowing the answer but needing to maintain the conversation, needing to keep Jennifer talking, needing to gather information. "Emma," Jennifer replied, and her voice contained a note of something couldn't quite identify. Fear, desperation, regret. "How old is Emma?" 3, she'll be 4 next month. Knelt down slightly, bringing himself closer to the child's eye level. Scout's tail continued to wave slowly, the dog's entire body relaxed now, as if the hard work had been accomplished and the rest was simply waiting. "Hi Emma, I'm Officer, this is Scout. Scout seems to think you're pretty special." Paused, choosing his next words with extreme care. "Is there anything you need to tell me? Anything that's making you sad?" Emma's hand remained on Scout's head and her eyes filled with fresh tears, but she didn't speak again. The words had come. The plea had been made. Now it was up to the adults to act. "I think we should get going," Jennifer said, her voice now strained to the point of breaking. She reached out and grabbed Emma's arm, not roughly but with urgency. "Come on, kids, let's head home." But gently placed his hand on Jennifer's arm. "Actually, I'd like to ask you a few more questions if you don't mind. Maybe we could step over here for a moment." He gestured toward a nearby bench, away from the crowd but still in public view. Scout remained with Emma, his body pressed against the small child's legs, his presence speaking volumes about what his instincts had detected. 2 words had changed everything. A 3-year-old's desperate plea had initiated a chain of events that would ultimately determine the fate of 2 children and reshape the trajectory of their mother's life. The fair continued around them, but knew that nothing about this afternoon would ever be routine again. That night, Officer sat in his apartment, unable to sleep despite the hour growing late. Scout lay on the rug beside his bed, also restless, occasionally lifting his head as if checking to make sure his partner was still there. The television played quietly in the background, some late-night news program that wasn't really watching. His mind kept replaying the events of the afternoon, turning them over and over like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together yet. After the encounter at the fair, had conducted an initial conversation with Jennifer at that nearby bench. He'd been gentle, professional, non-accusatory, the way he'd been trained to handle potentially sensitive situations. But even in that brief exchange, red flags had waved so persistently that he'd felt as though he was standing in a hurricane. Jennifer had been evasive about basic details. When asked where the family lived, she'd given an address but seemed reluctant to provide it. When asked about Tommy's school, her answers had been vague and contradictory. First, she'd said the boy attended Lincoln Elementary, then she'd corrected herself, saying it was elementary. When had asked about Emma's pediatrician, Jennifer's jaw had tightened, and she'd mumbled something about not having found a regular doctor yet. The bruises had bothered the most. He'd noticed them during that brief conversation at the bench. Tommy had a distinct wrist mark, finger-shaped bruises that indicated someone had grabbed the child forcefully. The pattern was too specific to be accidental. Emma had a small bruise on her upper arm, similarly shaped. And Jennifer herself bore the marks of what looked like domestic violence. The jaw bruise barely concealed, a small cut near her eye, and the way she'd flinched when Tommy had suddenly moved too quickly. By the time the fair had ended and Jennifer had hurried her children away, had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let this go. Emma's 2 words helped me combined with Scout's unprecedented reaction and the physical evidence of abuse had crystallized into something that demanded action. Now, in the darkness of his apartment, made a phone call to his supervisor, Lieutenant David. It was nearly midnight, but had told him years ago that cases involving children could call at any hour. "We've got a situation," had said quietly. "A family at the fair today, a 3-year-old girl possibly being abused. I need to file a report and contact CPS." Had listened carefully as explained everything: Scout's strange behavior, Emma's plea, the physical signs of abuse on both children, Jennifer's evasiveness, the inconsistencies in her story. When had finished, there had been a long silence on the other end of the line. "Trust Scout," had finally said. "I've worked with that dog long enough to know his instincts are sound. File the report. Contact CPS first thing tomorrow morning. I'll make sure the paperwork gets expedited." The next morning, had arrived at the station early and spent 3 hours documenting everything. He'd written a detailed report about the fair incident, Emma's statement, Scout's behavior, and his observations about the family's condition. He'd included descriptions of the visible bruises, Jennifer's nervous behavior, the discrepancies in her answers, and his professional assessment that the children were in potential danger. By mid-morning, had made contact with Portland's Child Protective Services office. He'd spoken with a caseworker named Sarah, no relation, though they joked about the coincidence. Sarah had listened intently to his report, asking detailed questions about the children's appearance, Jennifer's demeanor, and the specific circumstances of Emma's statement. "This is concerning," Sarah had said, her voice taking on the serious tone of someone who had spent years in child protective work. A 3-year-old speaking those exact words, unprompted in that context. "That's not typical behavior. I'm going to schedule a home visit. Can you provide me with the address?" Had given her the information Jennifer had provided, along with his observations about the neighborhood and the building. He'd also explained Scout's role in the discovery, which had initially drawn a slightly skeptical response from Sarah. "I know it sounds unusual," had explained, "but I've worked with Scout for 3 years. I've never seen him behave that way. The dog detected something that drew him specifically to this child, and his instinct was confirmed by the child's statement. Sarah had paused, then asked something that would never forget. "Officer, in your professional opinion, do you believe these children are in immediate danger?" The question had hung in the air between them. Had thought about Emma's hollow eyes, about Tommy's protective grip on his sister's hand, about the finger-shaped bruises and the evasive answers. He'd thought about Scout's trembling body and that moment of perfect communication between dog and child. "Yes," had answered firmly, "I believe they are." That conversation had set events in motion. Sarah had told him she would conduct an initial home visit within 48 hours. She'd also explained the process. If she observed signs of abuse or neglect, she could initiate a formal investigation. If the children appeared to be in immediate danger, she could contact law enforcement for assistance in removing them from the home. Over the following days, had found himself unable to focus on regular patrol duties. His mind kept drifting to the family. He'd done some background research, accessing public records that revealed Jennifer's address had changed 6 times in the past 4 years. Court records showed a restraining order filed against someone named Martinez 3 years ago, though the case had been dismissed. There was also a history of calls to the address where Jennifer currently lived, reports of domestic disturbances, though none had resulted in arrests. The pattern was becoming clearer. Jennifer wasn't just a negligent parent. She was a woman trapped in a cycle of abuse and instability, and her children were suffering the consequences of her circumstances. On the 3rd day after the fair, Sarah had called back. "We conducted the home visit yesterday," she'd said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Officer, the conditions in that apartment are worse than I anticipated. There's no running water in 2 of the bathrooms. The kitchen is filthy. There are visible signs of drug use. The children's bedroom is essentially a closet with a mattress. Emma hasn't seen a doctor in nearly 2 years. Tommy has missed so much school that the district is considering truancy charges against the mother." Had felt his chest tighten. "I'm opening a formal investigation," Sarah had continued. "I've recommended to my supervisor that we consider emergency removal of the children, but I need more information from you. Anything you can provide about your observations, about Scout's behavior, about the child's statement, everything matters." That night had sat down and written out everything in detail. He described the fair, the moment Scout had locked eyes with Emma, the way the child had spoken. He'd written about the bruises, the evasive answers, the signs of abuse and neglect. He documented Scout's role in discovering what might otherwise have gone unnoticed. And he'd realized that sometimes, the most important cases weren't solved through detective work or forensic evidence. Sometimes, they were solved by a dog's instinct and a child's courage to speak 2 words that changed everything. Sarah stood outside the apartment building on Portland's southeast side, clipboard in hand, her jaw clenched with grim determination. It was a gray afternoon, the kind that Portland specialized in, where the sky seemed to press down on the earth with a suffocating weight. The building itself was a tired-looking structure from the 1970s, 3 stories of faded brick and broken windows. Trash littered the parking lot. The front door hung slightly ajar, its lock apparently broken for some time. She climbed the external stairs to the 2nd floor, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Apartment 2C was where the family lived according to the records. Sarah knocked firmly, her hand gripping her identification badge. She'd been doing this work for 12 years, and her instincts were sharp. She could sense danger the way other people sensed weather changes. The door opened slowly. A man mid-30s, with aggressive eyes and a muscular build, stood in the doorway. His expression immediately turned hostile when he saw Sarah's badge. "Yeah," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "What do you want?" "I'm Sarah from Child Protective Services," she said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "I'm here to conduct a wellness check on the children living in this residence." "There's no kids here," the man said, starting to close the door. Sarah placed her hand against the door, not aggressively, but firmly. I'm going to need to see the residents and speak with the children. This is a routine check. The man, who Sarah would later learn was Martinez, Jennifer's boyfriend, glared at her with barely concealed fury. But he stepped back, allowing her entry. What Sarah saw inside the apartment made her stomach turn. The living room was filthy beyond comprehension. Empty beer cans and liquor bottles covered every surface. Fast food containers in various states of decay sat on the coffee table, their contents moldering into unrecognizable substances. The smell hit her first, a nauseating combination of stale alcohol, unwashed bodies, mold, and something else she couldn't quite identify. The windows were covered with blankets instead of proper curtains, blocking out natural light and creating a cave-like atmosphere. "Jennifer," shouted toward the back of the apartment, "someone's here." Jennifer emerged from a bedroom, her face flushing with panic and shame. She was wearing yesterday's clothes, wrinkled and stained. Her hair was uncombed. She looked like a woman who had given up. "Where are the children?" Sarah asked, her voice taking on an edge of official authority. "They're sleeping," Jennifer replied weakly. "It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon," Sarah observed. "I need to see them now." Jennifer led Sarah down a narrow hallway to a small room at the back of the apartment. The door was padlocked from the outside. Sarah's heart rate immediately accelerated. A padlock on a children's bedroom was not a normal thing. "Why is this door locked?" Sarah demanded. "We lock it when we go out so they don't wander," Jennifer said, her voice trembling. "It's safer that way." Appeared behind them, his expression menacing. "Is that illegal?" Sarah ignored him and watched as Jennifer fumbled with a key to unlock the padlock. The door swung open, and Sarah's worst fears materialized before her eyes. The room was a closet. Literally, it was a converted linen closet approximately 6 feet by 8 feet. A single mattress sat on the floor, stained and reeking of urine. There were no windows, no furniture except the mattress, no toys or books. Tommy and Emma lay on the mattress, both appearing to be asleep despite the afternoon hour. "How long have the children been sleeping?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing through protocols for emergency removal. "Since morning," Jennifer said. "They were hungry and I didn't have money for food, so I gave them some medicine to help them sleep." "What kind of medicine?" Sarah's voice had gone cold. Jennifer hesitated. "Just something for sleep, had some." Sarah didn't need to hear more. She pulled out her phone and called the police non-emergency line. She needed documentation. She needed law enforcement present as a witness to what she was seeing. Within 20 minutes, officer and 2 additional officers arrived at the apartment. Sarah had specifically requested, knowing that he'd been instrumental in bringing this case to her attention. When he entered that tiny room and saw the conditions in which the children had been living, she saw the rage flash across his face. "We're documenting everything," Sarah said quietly too. "Medical examination will be mandatory." The officers began photographing the room, the filthy mattress, the locked door, the absence of any basic amenities. Sarah conducted a more thorough examination of the apartment, and what she found was worse with each room. The kitchen was a biohazard. The refrigerator, when she opened it, contained nothing but rotting food and a mysterious liquid that had congealed at the bottom. The bathroom had no running water. The pipes had been disconnected months ago, apparently. Mold covered the walls. There were drug paraphernalia scattered on various surfaces: pipes, small bags, scales. In Jennifer's bedroom, Sarah found medical records confirming that neither child had received a doctor's visit in nearly 2 years. She found Emma's birth certificate and vaccination records, all incomplete. She found school attendance records showing that Tommy had been absent for 42 days out of the current school year alone. But the most damning evidence came from a conversation with Tommy once he'd been gently awakened. The 6-year-old, disoriented and groggy from whatever sedative he'd been given, spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone about his life. "Hurts Mama," Tommy said, his small voice hollow. "And he hurts us when Mama can't stop him. We don't go to school a lot because says teachers ask too many questions. When we're bad, we get locked in the room. Sometimes we don't eat for a whole day." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes as she documented the child's statement. She was experienced enough to know that children often minimized abuse, so if Tommy was saying this, the reality was likely worse. Medical examinations were arranged immediately. Emma was transported to the hospital first, where doctors found signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and untreated infections. She had a urinary tract infection that had gone unaddressed, explaining some of her lethargy and withdrawal. Tommy's physical examination revealed old bruises in various stages of healing, consistent with repeated physical abuse. There were finger-shaped bruises on his ribs, as if he'd been grabbed or struck multiple times. Was arrested at the scene for drug possession and child endangerment. Jennifer was arrested as well, though her role was more complicated. She was both a victim of abuse and a perpetrator of neglect toward her own children. By evening, both Emma and Tommy had been placed in emergency protective custody. The state moved quickly to find them emergency foster placement with the family, a licensed foster home with an excellent reputation. Sarah sat in her office late that night, completing paperwork and updating case files. She thought about Officer and his remarkable dog. She thought about a 3-year-old's courage in speaking 2 simple words. She thought about how close this case had come to falling through the cracks, to remaining hidden behind a locked door in a filthy apartment. Sometimes the truth was hiding just beneath the surface. It took courage, instinct, and compassion to bring it into the light. 2 children's lives now depended on the fact that someone, a dog, a child, and a dedicated officer, had refused to look away. Emma woke up in a bed, a real bed with soft sheets and a fluffy pillow, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, gentle and warm. The room smelled like lavender and something else she couldn't quite identify. Her small hand reached out and touched the fabric of the comforter, marveling at its softness. She'd never felt anything like it before. Footsteps approached the door, and Emma tensed instinctively, her body remembering fear before her mind caught up. But the woman who entered was smiling, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. This was Mrs., her new foster mother. She was in her mid-50s, with dark skin and kind eyes, and she moved with a gentleness that gradually began to ease Emma's constant state of anxiety. "Good morning, sweetheart," Mrs. said softly. "Did you sleep well? I made breakfast. Tommy's already eating in the kitchen. Would you like to join us?" Emma nodded slowly, still not quite believing that this was real. She climbed out of bed, her small feet touching carpet instead of the bare floor she was accustomed to. Carpet. She'd forgotten what carpet felt like under her toes. The household was a place of structure, safety, and quiet love. Mrs. and her husband, Mr., had been foster parents for 23 years. They'd raised 17 children to adulthood, watching them transition out of the system and into independent lives. Their home was modest but immaculate, clean in a way that Emma and Tommy had never experienced. There were books on shelves, pictures on walls, a kitchen with food in the refrigerator, normal things that signaled safety and stability. Over the first week, Emma barely spoke. She observed everything with wide, cautious eyes. She flinched at loud noises. She hoarded food in her pockets, terrified that it would disappear. She had accidents during the night, her small body still processing the trauma it had endured. But Mrs. responded with patience instead of anger. She changed the sheets without complaint. She held Emma when the girl woke screaming from nightmares. She whispered reassurances. "You're safe now. You're home." Tommy's adjustment was different. At 6 years old, he carried the weight of having tried to protect his sister. The first few days, he barely left Emma's side, as if afraid that something terrible would happen if he let her out of his sight for even a moment. He ate mechanically, without tasting his food. He spoke in monosyllables. The lightness that should have characterized a 6-year-old seemed to have been completely drained from him. But gradually, imperceptibly, changes began to occur. Mrs. enrolled both children in the family's pediatrician, Dr. Helen. The name was coincidence, but Emma found herself opening up to Doctor in ways she hadn't expected. Over several visits, Doctor identified and treated Emma's urinary tract infection, prescribed vitamins for her malnutrition, and arranged for a developmental specialist to evaluate the little girl's delayed speech and emotional development. "Emma will catch up," Doctor assured Mrs. during a follow-up appointment. "She's showing remarkable resilience. The fact that she's beginning to speak more, that she's starting to play, that she's allowing herself to trust you, these are all excellent signs. Trauma recovery isn't linear, but this child is already on an upward trajectory." 2 weeks into the placement, something remarkable happened. Tommy laughed. It was a small laugh, barely more than a giggle, when Mr. made a silly face at the dinner table. But it was genuine. For the first time since being removed from his mother's home, Tommy experienced a moment of uncomplicated joy. Officer received updates on the case through official channels. Sarah sent him progress reports, and he read each one with an intensity that surprised his colleagues. He attended the initial custody hearing, where a judge reviewed the evidence against Jennifer and was facing serious charges: child endangerment, drug distribution, assault. He would likely spend years in prison. Jennifer's situation was more complicated. She was both a victim and a perpetrator. The court ordered her to complete a comprehensive rehabilitation program: substance abuse treatment, parenting classes, anger management counseling, and psychological evaluation. If she completed these programs successfully and demonstrated genuine change, there was a possibility, though not a guarantee, that supervised visitation with her children might eventually be permitted. "The mother is trying," Sarah told during a phone call. "I won't say she's a model client, but she's attending her sessions. She's acknowledging her responsibility in failing to protect her children. She's working with a therapist on processing the abuse she herself experienced. It's slow progress, but it's progress." Found himself invested in Jennifer's rehabilitation in a way that surprised him. This wasn't his typical role. Usually, he documented abuse and moved on to the next case. But this case had gotten under his skin because of Scout, because of Emma's 2 words, because of those children's desperate circumstances. 3 months into the foster placement, Emma spoke her first full sentence to Mrs. "I like it here," she said simply, her small voice gaining confidence. "Can I stay here forever?" The question broke Mrs. heart and healed it simultaneously. "We're going to do everything we can to make that happen," she promised, pulling the little girl into an embrace. Tommy, meanwhile, started first grade. His new teacher, Mrs., noticed immediately that he was significantly behind academically. His reading skills were minimal. His math abilities were virtually non-existent, but she also noticed something else. Tommy was hungry to learn. When she worked with him one-on-one, his eyes lit up with the joy of discovery. By December, he'd caught up to grade level in reading. By spring, he was ahead of many of his peers. Officer attended a court hearing 6 months after the initial removal. The judge reviewed the children's progress in foster care, Mrs. about their physical and emotional recovery. Doctor provided medical documentation of their improving health. Sarah presented her case assessment, noting that both children had thrived in a safe, stable environment. "The evidence is clear," the judge stated. "The children are safe and making excellent progress in their current placement. However, we must also consider the possibility of family reunification with the biological mother, should she complete her rehabilitation program and demonstrate genuine change." The judge ordered that reunification services continue. Jennifer would have continued access to counseling and support services. In 1 year, there would be another hearing to determine whether supervised visitation with her children might be possible. Felt conflicted about this outcome. Part of him wanted the children to remain permanently with where they were thriving. But another part of him understood that Jennifer deserved a chance at redemption, at becoming the mother her children deserved. Scout sat beside in the courtroom gallery, as he often did during important cases. The dog seemed to understand the significance of these moments. As they left the courthouse, Emma's social worker stopped and showed him a drawing Emma had made in her foster home. It depicted a little girl, a German shepherd, and a police officer, all holding hands in a field of flowers. "She talks about Scout constantly," the social worker said. "That dog changed her life. I thought you should know that." Knelt down and hugged Scout, feeling tears threaten to spill over. This case had started with a mysterious stare, 2 desperate words, and the instinct of an extraordinary dog. Now, 6 months later, 2 children were healing, a mother was working toward redemption, and an officer understood more deeply than ever the power of compassion and second chances. The work wasn't finished. The real test would come in the months and years ahead. But for the first time, there was genuine hope that this fractured family might somehow be put back together, or that at the very least, the children would have the chance to grow up safe, loved, and whole. 9 months had passed since that fateful day at Riverside Park. Officer stood in the community center on a Friday evening, adjusting his dress uniform and wondering how he'd gotten roped into being the guest of honor at a community appreciation event. Scout sat beside him in perfect heel formation, also dressed for the occasion with a specially tailored vest that read Portland Police Department K-9 Unit in bold letters. The event had been organized by the family and supported by the local Child Advocacy Center. It was called Heroes Among Us, a celebration of community members who made a difference in children's lives. Had received the invitation with some embarrassment. He'd simply done his job, he'd thought. But Sarah had been insistent that he attend, hinting that there would be someone there who wanted to thank him personally. The auditorium was filling up with people. Teachers, social workers, foster parents, police officers, and community volunteers filed into their seats, recognized many faces from the investigation and follow-up work. Sarah waved from the 3rd row. Mrs. sat in the front row with her husband, and beside them sat 2 children that made heart skip a beat. Emma was transformed. She wore a yellow dress with a white collar, her hair brushed and styled with a yellow ribbon. Her face was round and healthy, her cheeks flushed with the vitality of a child who was being properly nourished. But it was her eyes that struck most powerfully. Those hollow, vacant eyes that had stared at Scout that afternoon at the fair were now bright and alive, filled with intelligence and emotion and hope. Tommy sat beside Emma, taller than remembered, wearing dress pants and a blue button-down shirt. His posture was, his demeanor more confident. He was reading a program, and when he looked up and saw, he smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile that was nothing like the wary, protective expression he'd worn when first met him. The event began with speeches from various community leaders, acknowledging the work of foster parents, social workers, and law enforcement in protecting vulnerable children. Sarah spoke about the intersection of professional expertise and instinct in identifying abuse. A representative from the Child Advocacy Center discussed the importance of listening to children, no matter how young or how simple their words might seem. Then it was time for what the program called special recognition. A social worker took the microphone and began to tell the story of a remarkable case from 9 months ago. She spoke about a 3-year-old's courage. She spoke about a police dog's inexplicable instinct. She spoke about the cascade of events that had saved 2 children's lives. Officer and his partner Scout, the social worker said, demonstrated that sometimes the most important investigative tool isn't technology or forensic evidence. Sometimes it's simply being present, paying attention, and trusting instinct when something doesn't feel right. The audience applauded as felt his face burning with embarrassment. But before he could fully process his discomfort, Mrs. stood up and led Emma toward the stage. Emma walked slowly, deliberately, her small hand gripping a piece of construction paper that she'd been carefully protecting. Mrs. accompanied her to the microphone, and Emma looked absolutely tiny standing before the crowd, but there was no fear in her expression. Instead, there was determination and purpose. "Hi," Emma said, her voice still soft but clear and confident. "I'm Emma. I'm 3.5 years old. I want to say thank you to Officer and Scout." The audience fell silent. A hush descended that was more powerful than any amount of applause. "Scout helped me find my voice," Emma continued, reading words that Mrs. had helped her practice but delivering them with genuine feeling. "When I couldn't tell anyone what was wrong, Scout understood, and Officer listened. He helped me, and now I'm safe." Emma held up her drawing, the same one had seen before but now framed beautifully. It showed Officer, Scout, and Emma, all connected by a rainbow of colors. At the bottom, in careful letters that showed remarkable improvement from months ago, were the words, "Scout saved me. Officer helped. I am safe now." The entire audience stood up. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming. Several people openly wept, felt tears streaming down his own face as Emma walked directly to him and wrapped her small arms around his neck in a fierce hug. Scout, sensing the emotional significance of the moment, pressed gently against both of them, his tail wagging slowly. "Thank you," Emma whispered in his ear, her voice barely audible beneath the applause. "Thank you for listening." Tommy came up then, holding his own drawing. His artwork was more sophisticated, showing the progression from darkness to light, a house that transformed from black and gray to bright colors filled with sun and flowers and smiling faces. He shook his hand formally, the way a young man would, and said, "Mrs. says you and Scout are why I get to be happy now." The evening continued, but was barely present for the rest of it. He was caught in the profound reality of what had transpired. Two children whose lives had been shattered by abuse and neglect now stood before a community, publicly acknowledging their survival and recovery. The courage it took for Emma to stand at that microphone and speak her truth, the same truth she'd communicated that day at the fair, was remarkable. Later, as people mingled and celebrated, Sarah approached with news. "Jennifer completed her rehabilitation program," Sarah said quietly. "She's been clean for 6 months. She's been consistently attending therapy. The judge has approved supervised visitation to begin next month." Felt conflicted emotions swirling inside him. "How do you think it will go?" "I think Jennifer has genuinely changed," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "She'll never be a perfect mother, none of us are, but she's working hard to become a safe one. And Emma and Tommy are resilient. With proper support and boundaries in place, I think there's a real possibility of eventual family reunification, or at minimum, a healthy ongoing relationship between mother and children." As the evening wound down, sat in his car in the parking lot with Scout, watching the last of the attendees leave. Scout rested his head on shoulder, the dog's warm breath comforting in the cool evening air. "You know what you did that day, Scout," said softly, running his hand along the dog's neck. "You did something extraordinary. You sensed suffering that I missed. You communicated with a child in a language that transcended words. You reminded me why I became a police officer in the first place." Scout's tail thumped against the back seat, and smiled despite the tears still wet on his cheeks. Over the following years, would continue to receive updates on the family. Emma and Tommy maintained their placement with but eventually had supervised visits with Jennifer that gradually became less supervised and more genuine. Jennifer never fully regained custody. The court determined that the children's safety was best served by remaining primarily with but she became a consistent, loving presence in her children's lives. Emma never forgot the day at the fair, though the specific details faded with childhood. What remained was a deep-seated understanding that speaking truth mattered, that someone would listen, that help existed when things were unbearable. Tommy grew into a thoughtful, empathetic boy who often talked about becoming a social worker himself, wanting to help other children the way he and Emma had been helped. And Scout. Scout continued his work with the Portland Police Department for 3 more years before retiring at age 6. He spent his final years as a beloved family dog with, sleeping in comfortable beds, playing in sunny backyards, and receiving endless affection from the man who understood that sometimes the most important part of police work wasn't solving crimes. It was simply listening to what dogs and children were trying to tell you about the invisible suffering happening behind closed doors. The circle had closed, not with an ending but with a beginning. 2 children had been given their lives back. A mother had been given a chance at redemption. And one extraordinary dog had reminded the world that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes they have 4 legs and instincts that surpass human understanding. Retry and make mistakes. Please double-check responses.